It's become a bit of a cliche to say that politicians have lost control of immigration. The idea that what we're witnessing now is the product of government incompetence or bureaucratic indifference. But in reality, that's a false narrative.
Coming up on British thought leaders, Mike Jones, Director of Migration Watch. Mike talks about why government immigration policy doesn't reflect public attitudes.
It's actually politicians who are out of touch with the evidence, and the gut instincts of the British public are more in line with what academics say.
And what we can do about Britain's massive influx of illegal immigrants.
The key thing to do is to amend or abolish the Human Rights Act. You could, replace it with something else like a British Bill of Rights.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders, I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Mike Jones, Director at think tank Migration Watch. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
Migration has become a kind of defining issue of our time. Everyone has an opinion on it. What do you think are the key things people should be thinking about when they take their stance?
I think when people are thrashing out their opinions on immigration, there are three key areas you've got to look at. Now, the first issue is population growth. For example, are you happy to live in a more densely populated society? Do you believe that rapid population growth boosts innovation, choice and novelty? And yes, there are some economists who argue that large-scale immigration leads to what they call economies of agglomeration. So that sounds very fancy, but it's a very simple concept. You have clusters of small businesses and large businesses that are interconnected, and they're geographically defined, and this obviously boosts the economy. However, there's a but here. Is there a point of diminishing returns? Right. So do the benefits of a larger population get less and less over time? And do they reach a point when the benefits actually completely vanish and population growth becomes negative? Does it lead to a more stressful life? Does it impose a cost on public services and transport? Now, I would argue yes to that, and I think that point has been breached very long ago, particularly in a city like London. Large-scale immigration increases congestion on roads, trains, buses, the tube. Obviously, you have smaller living spaces, you have less greenery, you've got larger class sizes, multilingual classrooms, which is very difficult for teaching. You've got longer waiting lists for NHS operations, longer waiting lists to see a GP, and of course then there's a whole impact on housing. So that's the first issue, it's population growth. The second issue would be the structure of the economy, the political economy. Do you believe in a society where employers in both the public and private sector can recruit whoever they like from wherever they like to keep the costs of wages and training as low as possible? Or do you believe in an economy that serves the national interest, British people as a whole, rather than vested interest groups? Now, obviously, I prefer the latter. I want organisations in the public and private sector to pay higher wages so that people are recruited to do difficult or unpleasant jobs. I want large organisations to improve working conditions, and that I want businesses and the public sector to invest in skills. They should be responsible for upskilling and reskilling the British workforce. And if a business model is failing, then I would rather that business invest in new technology or change their business model completely, rather than relying on cheap labour from overseas to keep their business model afloat. So in many ways, large-scale immigration does actually distort the economy. Now, the third issue you've got to look at is the upside and downside of diversity. So on the one hand, many argue that a more diverse society gives you more goods and services, although I'd say in an era of globalization, that argument is perhaps less persuasive. They also argue that with a more diverse society, people can intermingle, interact, you have a more liberal, open-minded population. But, and there's a but again, is there a point of diminishing returns? Can you become too diverse? What happens when groups of people live in their own enclaves, cut off from the rest of society? What if certain cultural values are incommensurable? incompatible with the values of the mainstream. And then, of course, there's a huge academic literature of the impact of diversity on trust, the rule of law, the delivery of public goods, and so on.
The current immigration situation is kind of portrayed sometimes as being a bit out of control. Politicians can't get a handle on it. How much of that is reality and how much of the situation is actually part of an economic choice, be it good or bad?
Yeah, it's become a bit of a cliche to say that politicians have lost control of immigration. The idea that what we're witnessing now is the product of government incompetence or bureaucratic indifference. But in reality, that's a false narrative. Post-Brexit, politicians have more control over immigration policy than they have in decades. Number one, we're not part of the European Union. There's no freedom of movement. We're not party to the Dublin Convention on Refugees. And obviously, we're not subject to the rulings of the ECJ, the European Court of Justice. So politicians have not lost control of immigration. Politicians have surrendered control of immigration to various interest groups. And of course, politicians have issued visas for humanitarian and foreign policy reasons. Now, these are intentional, deliberate choices, so they haven't lost control. That's a complete myth. Now, how much of this is a choice? Well, it's completely a choice, and it's based on a combination of economics, humanitarian reasons, and obviously the stability of the higher education sector.
Does immigration bring a fiscal benefit to the UK?
Well, obviously, if you have elite migrants, then obviously that's going to be a benefit to the British taxpayer and the Treasury. If you have limited numbers of legal migrants with high human capital, you don't need a paper from the London School of Economics to tell you that. It's basic common sense. But the opposite applies to people in low-skilled and medium-skilled jobs. Obviously, these people are going to consume more in benefits and public services than what they contribute in tax, by and large. And the same goes for family members and dependents who are economically inactive. So it depends very much on A, the numbers of people arriving, and B, the composition of your immigrant population. If you look at the academic evidence on the fiscal impact of immigration, it's rather underwhelming, if I'm completely honest. Taken together, the studies show that the fiscal impact of immigration is between plus and minus 1% of GDP, so it's very small. But if you look at the sort of granular details, what you will find consistently is that immigrants from the European Economic Area, the EEA, contribute a surplus, whereas those from outside of Europe, outside of the European Economic Area, are a net fiscal drain. The most famous study that looked into this was commissioned by the Migration Advisory Committee, and the study was conducted by a consultancy called Oxford Economics. They're quite famous, and they looked at the numbers for 2016, 2017, and they found that European Economic Area migrants contributed about 4.7 billion to the economy, but those from outside of Europe were a drain of around 9 billion. Now that's quite concerning because today the vast majority of the population increase we've seen is from outside of the European Union. So it would be very interesting to see this type of research being commissioned again.
If the Exchequer's spending billions on immigrants, but the average taxpayer is not really any better off, GDP per head is not any better. But then at the same time, we've got these companies that are making big profits from the cheap labour coming in. And some people would see that as a wealth transfer from the taxpayer to the companies. Do you think that's a fair view?
Yes, the Marxist analysis works well in most cases. As you say, large-scale immigration is a redistribution program. It redistributes wealth from poorer to richer people, from labour to capital, from renters to landlords, from first-time buyers to established homeowners. And obviously it redistributes wealth from British citizens to the immigrants themselves and their families, either directly in the UK or those who are living overseas via remittances. So yeah, I would say that's a fair analysis, and George Boyas, a very famous Labour economist and expert in immigration, has made precisely that point, that it is a redistribution programme.
Putting the finances aside, you mentioned your second point about the cultural impact. What are the cultural effects of really high levels of immigration?
The academic evidence does paint quite a worrying picture of the impact of diversity on society. And this may come as a surprise to your viewers, because the narrative is that, academics are sort of out of touch and they don't touch controversial subject matter, and it's the tabloid journalists who are speaking truth to power. But actually there's a lot of really controversial stuff in academia, and it does paint quite a worrying picture of the impact of diversity. So, for example, there's research that shows diversity damages the provision of public goods. There's research, from Professor Bob Putnam that shows that diversity lowers the level of trust in society, not just between ethnic groups, but within ethnic groups themselves. There's research by William Easterly that shows that diversity, or what he calls ethnic fractionalisation, undermines the rule of law. There are even some studies that show that diversity can be strongly and negatively correlated with lower productivity. This doesn't mean to say that diversity is completely a negative thing. Obviously it isn't. But clearly there's a point of diminishing returns there, that, whatever benefits you do get from diversity, it doesn't continue indefinitely. And beyond a certain point, it could actually cause you problems further on down the line.
Based on the research your organisation has done, what do the public actually want when it comes to immigration?
Well, we commissioned a poll a couple of years ago asking respondents whether they support an Australian-style cap on immigration. And the response was overwhelmingly yes. It was about 71%. Of course, the Conservative Party abolished the one cap that we did have. That was established by Theresa May in 2010. Theresa May imposed a cap on non-EU workers. It was around 20,000. And it worked. The cap was never breached. But when the points-based system was introduced post-Brexit, they got rid of the cap and they lowered the standards. They debased the salary thresholds, they expanded the shortage occupation list, they got rid of the domestic labour market test, where you have to advertise jobs in the UK first. They introduced a graduate visa, where if you graduate you can stay in the country for a couple of years with no strings attached. So, what the public wants and what the politicians deliver are completely at odds. Another interesting poll we commissioned more recently is how the respondents saw the illegal immigration issue, and a majority, about 52%, saw illegal migration as a security threat. Sort of traditionally, people think that the general public are out of touch with the evidence, that actually the politicians are the real experts who are more in tune with data and research. But on the immigration issue, it's actually politicians who are out of touch with the evidence, and the gut instincts of the British public are more in line with what academics say, because there is a large literature on the security threat posed by large refugee inflows. The research has been there for decades. On this issue, there's a huge gap between what politicians do in office and what the general public wants. There's also a gap between what politicians say during an election campaign and how they actually govern when they're sort of holed up in SW1.
Immigration hasn't always been this left-right issue that it is now. Why do you think that came about? And do you think it kind of stops meaningful dialogue to some degree?
The point you make about the left-right framing of it is valid to some extent. I mean, in the past, both support and opposition to immigration restrictions cut across political parties. I mean, in the 1960s, the Conservative Party was the first to introduce restrictions on Commonwealth immigrants, but there were both Conservative and Labour MPs who were very much opposed to this. People were very much, imperial nostalgia was more of a thing back then, and they were afraid that restrictions on immigration would damage the UK's soft power. Moving into the mid to late 1960s, it all completely changed again. There was actually a cross-party consensus on immigration. When James Callaghan was the Home Secretary, he adopted a twin-track policy. So on the one hand, the Labour Party introduced anti-racism laws, to ensure that there's less discrimination and no colour bar. But on the other hand, they introduced quite strict immigration controls. And, Callaghan introduced the second Commonwealth Immigrants Act, which was seen by many people at the time as quite draconian. So there was that cross-party consensus. It wasn't really a left or right issue. It was whether were you prepared to respond to public opinion and public concern. However, this cross-party consensus fell apart in the early noughties, the late 1990s, early noughties, when the new Labour government was in power. Tony Blair was quite cautious of non-EU immigration, but he was a big fan of freedom of movement within the EU. When the Eastern European states joined, there were no transitional controls, even though other countries imposed them. The Home Office predictions on the number of people arriving in the country were completely out of kilter. We at Migration Watch said that the numbers would be much larger than what was expected, and they were. The Labour Party did other stuff as well, like they got rid of the primary purpose rule, which prevented sham marriages, so Jack Straw got rid of that. The Labour Party also had their own highly skilled migration programme, which was ironically based on a points-based system. Because it started off quite strict, they actually lowered the standards because not enough people were applying for it. The cross-party consensus did sort of evaporate in the noughties. What you see today is the Conservative Party not only embracing New Labour's ideology, but actually going even further than New Labour. The Conservatives have an immigration system that's even more liberal and allows even larger groups of people to come into the country. So, by comparison to, today's government, Tony Blair was practically conservative compared to Mr. Sunak. So the whole sort of left-right distinction has really been thrown up into the air. There's almost something politically androgynous about politicians on the pro-immigration side. They could fit into several political parties.
You mentioned earlier in your intro the housing crisis. Some people would say that's because we haven't been building enough houses for decades, and the NIMBYs are blocking development. How much of the housing crisis blame do you think can be pinned on immigration levels?
Well, a significant amount, for sure. There's a supply side issue there, for sure, with the planning system. NIMBYs have a lot of power. They can thwart building projects. Obviously, you've got protectionism on the Greenbelt, which some people argue is quite absolutist in its approach. So the supply side absolutely matters. Britain's planning regime is completely out of date and not fit for purpose. But, changing the planning system is politically very difficult. Robert Jenrick, a former immigration and housing minister, did try to reform the system, but Tory backbenchers were up in arms about it because they were afraid that NIMBYs in their own constituency would vote for the Liberal Democrats. So those reforms were completely mothballed, so it's politically very difficult. But what the Conservative Party could have done was restrict the number of people coming into the country. Again, restricting legal migration is straightforward. Controlling illegal immigration is more complicated because you have to change the legal system. There's no reason at all why Mr. Sunak could not have got the number of legal migrants down. And obviously, if you got those numbers down, that would ease the burden on the housing system. But as it is, rents have gone through the roof. The terms and conditions for mortgages have gotten stricter, and the housing crisis seems to be getting worse. And it's not just bad for people's disposable income, it's bad for the economy as a whole, because when house prices increase at a much more rapid rate than real wages, then that acts as a drag on productivity, particularly when the planning system won't allow businesses to open new premises. So it's a really horrible situation.
We had STP leader William Clouston on the show. He called for a generational pause when it comes to immigration. What do you think is the best way forward?
I think, first of all, the solutions for legal and illegal migration are completely different. So with illegal immigration, the key thing to do is to amend or abolish the Human Rights Act. You could, replace it with something else like a British Bill of Rights I think that's quite risky and a bit more controversial, but at the minimum, you need to amend the Human Rights Act, because basically what it does is it embeds the European Convention of Human Rights into British law. And fundamental to the convention is something they call the principle of non-refoulement. What that means is you cannot deport a failed asylum seeker, and sometimes even a foreign criminal. You can't deport them to a country where they might be at risk of, harassment or humiliation or persecution in some way. And the bar is set very low, so there only has to be a small risk there. So really, to get control of illegal migration, you need to address the Human Rights Act, and then you have lots of different returns policies. Rwanda could be in the mix there. If you can't remove someone to Afghanistan, for example, because of a lack of cooperation, and obviously Afghanistan is a very unsafe place, then you could return these people to a third safe country. But for many other countries, you could have returns policies. Turkey, for example, we should definitely have a returns agreement with Turkey. The Home Office has deemed Turkey unsafe. And here's another contradiction. Turkey is a member of NATO. They're members of the Council of Europe. They send judges to the European Court of Human Rights. But the Home Office, based on human rights law, regards Turkey as unsafe. So there's another contradiction in the system. So on illegal migration, that's what you need. On the legal side, the solution is a lot more straightforward. You need a net migration target. It could be less than 100,000. It could be net zero. That doesn't mean zero migration. It means that the inflow and outflow come into balance. So you need that target, and then you need to impose a cap on various visas to achieve that target. So you'd need a cap on family visas, a cap on student visas, potentially a cap on humanitarian visas, and obviously worker visas. You need also to get rid of loopholes. So the graduate visa route that allows recent graduates to stay here for up to 2 years. Many of them end up working in the gig economy or various other low-skilled work. You need to get rid of that. You also need to get rid of the shortage occupation list. And there has to be some plan for tapering down the numbers and training people here domestically. In terms of an immigration moratorium or a freeze on all immigration, I think that's possibly a bit too much. That would impose a huge shock on the system. It's like trying to crack a nut with a sledgehammer. Politically, I think it would be very difficult to do, and you cause more damage than what's necessary.
Mike Jones, thanks for joining us.